Okay, it looks like we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. I am a week away from my book coming out and I'm super, super excited. Woohoo! So, last chance to pre-order Mazes of Power while it's still on pre-order. And also come to San Francisco and see me on February the 8th at 3 at Borderlands Books. Nice. So that's my required advertisement. I'm very excited about it. And I thought that it would be kind of fun to do some related topics for Dive into World Building. So today we're doing what communicates power, and this is supposed to be, as it usually is, a sort of fiction world building kind of topic. That nonetheless pulls from a lot of inspirations in the real world. I don't want to get too real world right now. I'm struggling. So just that said, so communicating power. One of the things, there's all these different types of power, right? So you can communicate power by controlling your appearance. You can consider that indirect, I suppose, right? But appearance is often used to indicate membership in social groups. And when those social groups are social groups that have power, the power rubs off on the outfit.
Clothes maketh man.
Can we distinguish between power and authority? And say that
what would you, how would you distinguish those?
You can have power without having authority. You can have authority without having power. They're supposed to go together.
I think you need to define power and authority for that sentence to make sense. I'm confused too. Okay,
authority is, the dean of students has the authority to make student decisions about, what students are allowed to do. I'm making that up off the top of my head.
So are you implying that there's a jurisdiction question here? Is that
are we talking about societally defined ability to apply power versus things which do not have social sanction but are capable of affecting change?
Okay, that was way more complicated than I can.
Okay, so
process.
You know what? I don't think that continuing on this particular discussion of definitions is necessarily going to help. But what I think we should maybe do is start breaking out some of the elements of what we think of as power, right? Because you can have something like physical power, like height. Your height can communicate power, both socially and physically, I guess. But a badge can also communicate a very, very different kind of power. Is that the kind of distinction that you're talking about a little bit, Morgan?
Yeah, because a badge gives you a badge is a symbol of authority and power that goes with it. Sometimes having a badge allows you to exercise to do things that you don't actually have the authority to do because of the way it's perceived.
So you seem to be using the word authority in a way that suggests that there is social license, like explicit social license to do it.
Or more like you, maybe Morgan, you're thinking more like authority as in like formalized rules and set down, you can do X, Y, Z, whereas power is, but like for example, a cop going into a donut shop and the donut owner, and he gets a free donut because, well, they respect his power. That's not his authority to get that free donut, but the owner respects his power or is intimidated by such power. And so acquiesces and gives him the donut. He doesn't have the authority to get that donut, but he has the power to get that donut.
Because of the potential for abuse of authority.
Yes.
Can I just say we haven't defined power? And the best definition of power that I ever came across, and I don't remember the source, I'm sorry, is power is the ability to manifest intentions. And then
You're going to have to go, you know what? You're going to have to tell me what you think that means.
Well, so in order to have, we could metaphorically refer to like a storm having power or something like that. But what this suggests is that in order to have power in the way that we would be using it in this discussion, you have to have will. So you have to have an intention. You have to have the ability to form intentions. And then power is your ability to manifest those intentions in the real world.
Manifest, you mean? Well, that doesn't
Make
sound
real,
like...
make manifest, instantiate. So for example, I may wish
to impose your will on things.
Yeah, well, I may wish for the Equal Rights Amendment to become constitutional, to become the next amendment of the Constitution, but I don't have the power to cause that to happen, right? So I can't manifest that intention.
Okay. I'm not going to stick with that phrasing because I think the word manifest is a little, forgive me, but kludgy in that context.
I don't know that I'd call it kludgy, but I think it's very specialized.
Yeah.
And I think
there are also different kinds of power that Starhawk discussed in one of her books, philosophically, like power over is one kind of power.
So one of the things that we're going to need to do is distinguish between measurable force, right? Which is things like storm, wind, earthquake, right? A blow. Versus socially.
Can I try?
Defined power. Go ahead, Kat.
So I think that we want to talk about the distinction that you started on, which is where I was going, between the ability to do something concrete and physical versus the ability to do something that is about moving people or causing a shift in something that's not only physical.
Yeah,
right?
like opinion or behavior.
Opinions, behavior. And that I think Morgan's thought about authority has a certain relevance because there is sanctioned or the power that is conferred by that which is agreed on by everybody is where power should be, which is authority. And then there is sort of an oppositional or non-conferred but acquired power, which, and we talk about these things in terms of like social authority or social power or morals, moral authority or other amendments to the word authority or power that acknowledge that this isn't, and this is all very, this is us trying to bootstrap the tools, which makes it really difficult.
It is rather tricky. What you're talking about has made me think of social capital.
Yes.
Which is a useful phrase.
So I find it useful to look at what other metaphors we can use when we're talking about power.
Yep.
One of them is to directly go into physics and to talk and to take what Cliff was saying, which is sort of power is defined by, can you set a direction and then get there? Can you get through the impediments and counter forces that you might have, right? The pushback.
Yep.
that's a certain kind of raw power. There's also, we talk about power is really amorphous in English because we use it to cover so many things. And
Yep.
there's also, this is why traditional D&D subdivides everything into multiple categories, right?
Yeah.
Of, physical strength and the ability to get around a situation, the ability to charm your way out of a situation. And all
Yeah.
of those are, we could call them power, right? And we traditionally give them these numeric values because they're comparators. But I think the thing that I was assuming this talk was about, which was much more narrowly confined, was how do you convey that a person has, specifically because I think we're talking about people are sentient beings in the context of genre world building, how do you convey the fact that they have the capacity to change their society or their world or the things around them in ways that perhaps are world building as opposed to just passing on assumptions of our own culture?
Sure.
The signs of authority can convey power that goes with the authority. But
Well, so if we look at, oh, sorry, Morgan, go ahead.
But I was also thinking that some powers, if you use them, have an effect on the user. Whether it's something as turns your hair gray or your skin gets.
We're talking about power that's wielded that has a cost because the cosmology of your world requires that wielding power you have to pay for it somehow.
So it's also, I think, kind of key to disambiguate. Well, a lot of times we deal with magical powers, right? And magical powers are cool. It's not the only thing that I'm talking about. One of the things that I think magical powers do in a lot of cases is serve as metaphorical representations of social power and other forms of power, like a representation of, I don't know, an alternate form of revolutionary might, or I think it's sort of is a way in some sense to abstract from the kinds of power that we see wielded in our world.
Yeah.
And how people cope with them in a very distinctly different situation.
Instead of power coming out of the barrel of a gun, barrel coming out of the barrel of a wand.
I mean, some of it is relatively direct. I was actually really surprised because I think I got through the entire first maybe 3 books of the Harry Potter series before I realized that she'd suddenly turned spells into bullets. And then I was like, why did you do that?
Well,
right?
the second movie makes it much more explicit. This movie gets there a lot faster when they have that dueling club. The movie sees it and jumps on that metaphor and makes it visible.
Yeah, because at first it was a lot more sort of
Wingardium Leviosa.
Like I could shoot a spell and it would miss you, right? I would, there was a metaphorical change that happened in the underpinnings of that world, and I went, wait a second, right? So, this is why we have this discussion, right? So that we can help people make those decisions up front, so they don't have to suddenly discover that their entire underpinnings changed.
So what kind of enough things?
So you're talking about creating a consistent magic system.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
it's a different discussion.
No.
Yes, but no.
Okay, but so if you look at, even if you're not dealing with magic powers, looking at the exercise of social power, for example, which I guess is really what we want to look at. What effect does that have on the person using that power, and is that effect shown in a way that is visible to people? Does it is whether it's a cost or some other change that makes you look at that person or listen to that person and say, hey, they've been using this power, this, you know, something has changed in them. You know, what is it that you're,
So
I mean, we all know that you know, that being a leader takes a toll. It's stressful and
Morgan, I think that you have an interesting axiom contained in your premise that we should actually expose rather than bump along with the assumption that it's a truism, which is that if power leaves an imprint, then what is that imprint is the question I hear you posing.
Yeah.
And I think that's one way to look at it, but that is assuming that the impact is intrinsic to power and its wielding, which is a world building decision.
yeah.
Because there are other ways to handle that, which is, for instance, that having the trappings creates the power, which is another way that both magic systems and also social force work in story and also, you know, roughly in outside of story, where, you know, I have the badge, therefore, right? I put on the uniform, therefore, which is not the same as I have the power and I've used it, therefore it's left its mark on me. So I'm wondering if that goes back to the thing that you were talking about, separating out power and authority, because it's not the action of being the cop that has imbued the badge with what it has.
Yeah, but I'm not saying that those are mutually exclusive. If you have power,
I'm saying that the inextricability, if it's inextricable or not separable, then I think that itself is a world building choice.
So one of the
or just
thing-
a worldview difference.
Cliff,
Oh.
you were saying?
I didn't realize Kat wasn't done. So are
I'm
you
done.
done? Okay, sorry. So one of the things I really like about Babylon 5 is the way that it conveys power visually. Sorry, I just got a phone call. Am I still there? Okay, good. So there's the way it conveys power visually. For example, if you have psionic power, you have to join the Psi Corps, and you have a badge that's like the letter Psi. And then if you are particularly powerful psionic, you have to become a Psi cop, and your job is to be police officer over the others, and you have a black uniform and the badge. So the badge conveys a certain amount of power. The uniform conveys a much more visible power, but only when combined with the badge, indicating that you are a psionic. And so it's a literal. One is just a literal power, and like a magic power, psionics, and the other is like telepathy, and the other is an authority as well. And the interesting thing is, because they're in this sort of walled off community, then the badge also indicates limitations to the power, like the requirement that you wear gloves all the time, that you're not allowed to gamble at a casino, things like that. And so it's not just pure power. So it's very interesting and subtle. Right?
Well, okay, so I think we're getting into something interesting here that is worth exploring, because this is actually going to be a little bit more fruitful, I think, on the world building side of it than definitional wrangling, though that was helpful and it's very useful to start with that. No, I mean, that was where I wanted to start, so I'm glad we did. But the power is not, so take this psionic example, right?
Sure.
You have something that you can do that is not necessarily visible to others, right?
Right? You can read their mind without them
But somebody decided that it was important that that be labeled. So the person who wears the badge or wears the mark has a power that is sort of represented by the badge. But at the same time, there's somebody else out there who said, I have the power to say that if you have this ability, you need to be visibly identifiable.
Yes.
Right. And both of those things I think are interesting. And they function differently. Those are, you know, people. So one of the things that I have noticed about power is that power comes in different forms, right? And people will use what they have. If your only power is that you're allowed to say yes or no to suitors, you're going to use it to the hilt, right?
Yes.
That you're going to say, okay, well, I've got this really limited frame of power and I'm going to use this in whatever way I can to help me get to a place that makes me feel like I'm accomplishing what I need, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, so the power to label is one thing. The power to have magic powers is another. They're very different, right?
But they're both power.
Right.
There's
But so I think it's interesting to, I don't know.
there's power over your own life and there's power over other people's lives.
I like to talk about levers and to talk about whether or not you have the ability to apply the lever and whether it's a question of clearing the space to put the lever in a place where it can be used, and whether that lever is made out of really durable materials or not, right? Because traditionally in political science and other things, we talk about soft power. And when we're talking about power and, you know, the power to choose your suitors, for instance, in some traditional story building forms, these are not considered power. They're part of alternate stories that are told. And I'm wondering once again whether we're getting back to scope and sort of whether or not a thing is a very intimate one-on-one thing or whether it's a very large thing.
Yeah.
And I think that when we start defining everything as what changed, one of the things that gets left out of world building philosophy that starts that way is that we don't talk about the ability to keep things the same, because actually pretty much we live in chaos and entropy, so everything is going to change somehow, right?
Yeah.
Keeping things the same actually takes an expenditure of energy and effort.
Yes.
But we don't talk about that. And we also, at least as Americans, have narratives that very much decry preservation. And so examining the struggle there between preservation and non-preservation, what is being preserved and why, is an interesting thing, because that is, as humans, where our power struggles often exist. And also what we're struggling with as a global culture right now with preservation versus adaptation and change. So
can I add a little thing in here?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I always appreciated about linguistics and anthropology was that the way that they talk about culture and language. And culture and language are systems. And what they do is that they self-preserve and also change through usage and performance. Right? So while we perform our culture, we are simultaneously preserving it and changing it. Same with our language. So the reason why things stay the same is because people don't change them. But at the same time, there's this drift and it happens almost without us noticing on some level.
Because of the time scales, or just because things change, because that's just human nature. Nothing remains. You have to, as Kat said, you have to apply active power to maintain the status quo rather than change. It takes effort.
But we do. I mean, we do constantly. You know, I don't think that we think that hard all the time about how often we are trying to regulate the behaviors of others, but we're doing it all the time. You know,
How much effort that takes is a measure of how much power you have or how much opposition you have, which is interesting. And also, I like going back to the thing Morgan was saying about the cost of that, because there's a cost to not changing things, but we don't talk about that one. We always talk about the cost of changing things. And, well, what will happen if we do a really big change? And there's an assumption that we must change things slowly so that we don't pay terrible consequences.
mhm.
But we're currently paying terrible consequences for not having changed things.
Right.
So I like this explicit examination of costs that go with power and how something was applied or not applied.
Mhm. Mhm.
I feel like I want to throw parenting in here.
Yes, that's part of it.
Because there's a cost to changing things.
Yeah.
Your kid turns into an adult and doesn't need you anymore. There's a cost to not changing things. Your kid does not turn into an adult, needs you forever. You know, that is
Well, you know,
gross
okay, so
generalization,
yes,
and it's an examination of one place. And by
any
changing
child
things,
is not being influenced by a parent solely.
yeah, oh yeah, but you know,
Like, wow, I want to poke right at the heart of become an adult as a definition, but that's a whole different show.
Yeah,
That's a different
hour.
show.
oh, it's entirely different. But you use the power that you have as a parent to affect the way try to affect the way your child behaves towards other people, behaves towards themselves, the things that they know, the things they can do, the things they will be able to do. And there are things you want to change quickly and things you can't change quickly. You know, their decision-making skills, it's just, there's an enormous amount, an enormous range of things to be changed.
Right. And also the methods that we use are another issue, and parenting is another several hours of chat, but like fear-based strategies, reward-based strategies, you know, emulation-based strategies, there are all these different strategies. So yeah, I think one of the things is such a big topic, it's really easy to go off on tangents in all kinds of directions. I one of the things that I feel like I want to mention while we're talking about this is that the ability to say what you want and get it is not at all guaranteed. And And it depends on who is talking to whom.
Well,
For those
online,
of you who have read my book, I'm thinking about Gar and Tamalara.
Ha
And no, you can't do that. And how, he will completely ignore it. Like, yeah, never mind. Like, just barrel on past. And there are very specific things that in that situation, when Gar is just sort of running over her about a billion times, there are very specific things that she has to choose to do if she wants to make her will stick. But the risks of doing them are huge. Right? And so I think that often we don't look past the statement of what we want to consider how and whether we're able to make it stick in some manner.
I want to push on that but in predictable ways. So,
well, I mean, yeah, obviously it's something that some people have thought about a lot and other people have not thought about it as much.
I think that I want to, as long as we're talking about power, note that whether you think about that or not is itself a manifestation of power and disempowerment and marginalization. Because if you are a person who does not have much power in the world, you think about it constantly. Because attempting to do anything other than demonstrating compliance comes with a lot of peril. And so I think that saying something like, oh, well, we don't think about these things is itself a statement about who is considered we and who is not considered we in this.
Sure. And you know what? A lot of the time when I'm talking here, I'm talking about a stratum of discourse and world building that involves a lot of privileged people, which is why I tend to say things in that way. So yes, that is exactly why I'm saying it in that way. And that's why we are talking about how that differs with marginalized communities. So, yep, basically.
I like it when people define their we really clearly. It is one of the ways in which I am attempting a transformation in our culture, because I was just, it was only last weekend, at a panel where there was a whole lot of we being said, and I was the only person really not included in that we.
Yep.
And it was a very soft, unintentional display of marginalization and power. And
Right,
when I pushed back against it, I got squashed really badly. And
so part of the point is that talking about how we group people is very important.
yes.
And how we mark groups of people can happen in a lot of different ways. It can happen visually, it can happen linguistically, and all of that.
One of the things that's interesting, if somebody is trying to write the perspective of a disempowered person, is to think about what that character or characters and their culture considers we, and what is included in that, and what they assume that the default person is able to do. Because the assumptions of what a default person within the context of culture and who they consider a default person says a lot about who is empowered and disempowered within the culture that you've created as a world builder.
Yep. I think we and they is a whole other hour too.
Yep. So what you're touching on, Kat, sounds like marked and unmarked categories as far as what anthropology terms.
Closely related, but not identical to.
Okay. Because if you're all the unmarked categories, you are the default of the society. And
also that
is different.
Some of us code switch who the unmarked category is depending upon who the context is.
Sure.
And that if that's done deftly as a writer, it can be signaling the switch in circumstance, but you need an astute enough reader to get that.
It's a really
or
good-
you may wish to explicitly flag that that's happening if that's the kind of gaze and frame you're using. But that it is quite fundamentally how you convey power is who is we.
Yep.
Yep.
And also, that also gets us into the English language conventions about the royal we, and plural identity is wielded as power. And also in the ways that, are you allowed to say I is also power? Do you need to say I is also power? And the other one is, yes, when you say we or make assumptions, who's included in that?
Yeah, and there's also the what I jokingly refer to as the psychiatric we, which is sort of the condescending we. How are we feeling today? Which is the opposite of the royal we, but conveys.
Okay, so
Yes.
so if I may, the royal we actually has a particular definition,
Sure.
which is that the queen is linguistically licensed to speak simultaneously as herself, as the ruler of the British people, and as the head of the Episcopalian Church of England. That's how it gets officially defined.
Yes.
Does that mean that there was no royal we until the Anglican Church?
Well, I think since there are 3 entities there, it could be that it existed before that. I don't know.
Right. The
should look
other
up.
thing that we don't do as much in English, but has become an issue, is whether or not what form you use to refer to somebody is plural forms as polite forms versus singular in other languages.
Yes.
And also, so this is how we get into the fight about singular they. I've heard very quiet consternation that it is equivalent to the we of power, that singular they is some kind of power move. And I'm like, where did you come up with that one? That's really
Yes.
So
fascinating.
it's
But who
it
gets
is a
pronouns of
power
what
move.
sort
It's
is power?
I want power over what people
Over my
power over
pronouns.
myself,
Yeah.
my pronouns.
Yeah, but
And that
in
is
that
probably
sense,
what's disconcerting to people.
in that sense,
Mostly, but they
a
can't say that.
choice of he or she is also a move of power,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
But they is just marked because people aren't used to using it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I see what your
but-
point is
and-
about the VU forms and the usted forms and that kind of thing. It's not an argument that I've heard before, but I'm like, okay,
I think I was having this conversation with somebody who really wanted to be rather turkey or something and just knew that there was going to be too much social censure if that happened, and so struggling to rechannel their internalized assumption of power into a form that would be contextually possible in that moment. It was kind of awkward and weird, but
yeah,
worth
that
noting, I
sounds
think, is
like
a
it was an interesting
example.
conversation.
Sometimes you just think, I don't even know where to. There's no purchase on this thing because it's so astonishingly novel and terrible at once.
Yes. I have to go. So I had a couple of thoughts I'd like to mention before I go.
Cool.
One is, one of the ways to convey power online in modern day is having a blue check mark next to your name. Social
Well,
media.
again, that's one of those labeling questions and
Yeah.
who's entitled to label you and such. Yeah.
Yes, but I've heard, blue check mark people, right? I've heard that expression. The other thing that I think conveys power visually is superhero costumes. Does Clark Kent have, power and Superman have a different level of power, right?
Or a different kind of power, because Clark Kent can do things Superman can't. Clark Kent is a reporter. He flashes that
Yes.
badge. He can do things that Superman could not
Press
possibly
badge.
do. Yeah.
Right.
Now I want to
they
put
may
Clark
actually have
Kent
been
in the
given a
workman's
retreat.
coveralls.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay. I mean, we keep bouncing around to lots and lots of different things.
I'm tempted to talk about your book, but I don't want it. But your book isn't out yet. And how the two,
well, we'll talk
and-
about my book next week because we
Yeah.
have
We're gonna
the
get to
AMA
that.
coming.
I know it's
I
I
have-
got something to say about power, but people
I
haven't
have
read the
another
book
thing
yet.
we haven't talked about yet about power and how to convey it. It's how do people react to you,
Yeah.
which is like a huge one, right?
Yeah.
It's one of the ways that we can that like authors like Jane Austen and others sorts of explorations of hierarchy really convey power is in who cedes to you
Mm-hmm.
and who doesn't cede to you and what barriers are in your way. So how are you addressed is power, but also who doesn't speak up because you're around.
Well, and I think actually one of the things that we've been kind of demonstrating through all the different topics that we've talked about is there's this really interesting ambiguity between labeling power and then having the label become the power. Right? Like if you see the label, you feel the power of the label, but somebody else is deciding who gets the label. So there's this weird sort of interplay between who gets awarded power, who gets to exercise power, and how that gets passed on.
Labels,
The
or
mention
do
of
we want to be more broadly symbols of power?
Symbols of power.
I
Us.
wanted to say something about the workman's coveralls, and it may be quite a workman's coveralls gives you, access, which is also a power of access.
Hmm.
If
What's-
you put those on, you can get into places and exercise power that you're not necessarily entitled to if you have swiped them from someone.
All the
What's-
heist movies in the world.
Really
Yeah.
interesting though, and the reason I love Leverage as a series is because they talk about the fact that the coveralls themselves aren't enough. If you put a black man in coveralls and the society around them has not accepted that black man can be in the coveralls and have the anonymity and that's his role privilege, then he can't use them. If you think that a woman doesn't belong in those coveralls, she can't use it. So the coveralls have to be used synergistically with somebody expected to be in them.
Yep.
If you make a white man a maid in a hotel room, it won't work because nobody will believe that's who he is. Right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
In some cases, you could make him, for instance, gay or an immigrant, but nobody expects the white guy with a short haircut and who's clean cut and well groomed to be doing maid service. You can't have the room the cart with all the towels and the cleaning supplies on it, but you can give him a tray with room service on it because there's all these bits of hierarchy. And I hesitate to use the word caste because it's so intimately tied with in modern discussions with South Asia especially, but effectively in many places around the world we do have these expectations of this kind of person can be in that kind of role.
Mm-hmm.
And so that the trappings of authority and power aren't just the things that you can put on and don, but they're actually considered intrinsic. And are you going to build a world that's like that? Are you going to subvert that? Or are you actually going to completely ignore that? They're all important choices in how your world will work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's a scene of where Hardison is in coveralls, and he's in an office building, he's in an elevator, and he's got a mop and a bucket.
Yeah.
He changes in the elevator. He's got a suit and a tie.
Yeah.
And he gets a look from a guy who sees him in both outfits. And
I love that
Hardison
scene.
looks at him and says, what, we all look alike? When in fact, it is the same guy, but he manages to say, because he is Black,
Yeah. That's
he can
clever.
deflect the recognition that way. Elliot, who is white, would not have gotten away with it. He would not have been able to deflect the curiosity in the same way.
The
Now,
interesting
he looks
thing,
like he could punch you in the face if you bother him, so he probably would have gotten away with it, but not for the same reason.
interesting thing about Elliot in the coverall versus the suit is, in either case, Elliot canonically as character is defined as the guy who's so good looking that you notice him. He's not the anonymous guy that you overlook. And
Mm.
so nobody expects the guy in the suit to be conveying muscular, high charisma power without it being a marked case. And also nobody expects the guy in the coverall to be quite like that, because he does play with a lot of working class tropes, but he's not covering all of them. And so one of the characterizations of Elliot is not so much that he's a white guy, but that his power is not in his whiteness, it's in his muscularity and his charisma. If you put Nate in that same coverall and the suit, I think you could get away with it, because when Nate is in the coverall, he's going to be playing a nebbish. And when Nate is in a suit, he conveys, I'm a guy whose authority comes from my suit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
It's
so-
actually that whole show is probably it is a good example of lots of
There
uses of power.
is a reason why many of, I think especially like Michi Troda, who's now become the editor for the Cephala magazine.
Yay.
Yay.
So Michi and I have bonded, and so have other POC, talking about genre fiction and other things about leverage, because it is one of the few places that actually addresses all the ways in which it's very much an essay on power and how roles work and how trappings work and how social manipulation works. And so it's a great way to look at, by swapping in various characters into various scenarios, why would this story only work with that character? Or would it work with another character?
Mm-hmm.
You know, can we put the cute girl in this and make it still work? Can we put the older woman in this and still make it work? Because it's, all of their grifts are very much premised on using their individual skills really well, such that eventually later in the show you can get to, somebody's not in this episode, and so now we have to shuffle around all the roles, and now everybody's feeling really awkward because we know what we do in this role, but what do you mean I have to be that guy?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Parker-
The power of
Parker's stabbing
familiarity.
people with forks. Can she get past that urge to take the role that she needs to take? And
Can she be Sophie? This is really difficult.
yeah,
And it shows off the fact that sometimes we undervalue the things that a character can do because it's what we expect out of them, until we make somebody else do it, and then it becomes revealed, oh, that's actually difficult.
Mm.
So
Well, on
stuff.
that note, it's almost 5 o'clock.
but that is a very good way of showcasing so many different ways that power is conveyed. You know, clothing, tone,
Bearing. Yeah.
bearing,
Yeah.
Knowledge and the ability to apply it in just the right moments.
leverage.
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 I'm doing
Yeah,
a
and
rewatch.
I did mention
also,
leverage or levers earlier.
Well, and I also think there is an extra dimension there in terms of expertise, where an expert doesn't think about the processes of their expertise in the same way that a novice does. So there's a sort of an extra layer of meta level complexity that gets grasped in expertise.
How hard is it to rappel off the side of a building? Well,
You're gonna find out.
wah!
Yeah.
not just the trappings. Oh dear.
Oh dear.
Oops. I'm not sure that was response. I think there was a lot of screaming involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do like having, I want to go back to what does it cost you? And I feel like we don't do enough stories about what various decisions cost characters. We don't do a lot of aftermath stories. I'm trying to write some
That's
aftermath
true.
stories because I really am fascinated by them. And I feel like we really need these narratives right now. But yeah, we don't do enough stories about resistance as a kind of power. We don't do enough stories about how revolutions actually happen. We don't do enough stories about watching how entrenched power can become so obsessed with the entrenchment that they don't react well enough to catastrophes. Because we always like the stories of the plucky heroes that somehow managed despite all of the resistance. And we don't do the, well, what happened because nobody listened stories.
Mm-hmm.
So unexplored bits of fiction, somebody else please write them too.
Please thank him.
Yep. Yep.
Otherwise I'll have to go back to writing ridiculous stories about earwax or something.
I'm not even.
Let's okay, you do you.
Yepper.
I won't stop you. So what I'm going to say is I think we need to wrap up. Thank you for the discussion. I'm glad everybody was here, and yay. So next week is going to be a little unusual. I'm going to be having people ask me questions about my book, which is going to be really weird. So there may be a lot of people here, conceivably. I don't even know, but we're just going to see how we go.
Do we have enough people who are familiar with your book to ask you questions that are useful within that framework? Because I haven't read it yet, so.
We have some.
Okay.
I will
Morgan
have
has
finished
read
it
and
by
Paul
then.
has read it. And I have other people who are going to, I think, be here who've read it, but I'm not sure. Paul and Morgan, don't you let me down, okay?
Unless
I won't let
catastrophe
you down.
happens, I will be here.
I'm looking and I'm like, I feel very left out. Paul and Morgan have read this. But
I'm sorry. I
I-
begged Julia for a copy.
It's almost out. It's just a week, I swear. I'm sorry. Yeah, so anyway, I'm kind of nervous and this will be really cool. And
I think it'll be fun.
come ask me questions. Yeah, so at the moment, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us off the air. Thanks again for being here, and then we will chat some more.